Welcome back to Beans and Bezels. In this video, I'll be taking a look at my first Vostok Europe watch, which is a Lithuanian-based watch brand with an interesting history and a very definitive design style that is very popular in Eastern Europe. One of the more interesting parts of running Beans and Bezels is getting to spend time with watches from corners of the world that do not always get much attention in enthusiast circles. Even when they are not entirely homegrown in the strictest manufacturing sense, they still tend to carry something of their local identity in the way they are designed, themed, and ultimately presented. Vostok Europe is a good example of that. Its story begins in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, with founder Igor Zubovsky first entering the watch trade in the early 1990s after receiving 2 briefcases full of Vostok Komandirsky watches as payment for work, before formally establishing Vostok Europe in 2003 and showing its first collection at Baselworld in 2004. The connection to Russia's Vostok is real historically, but today the relationship is better understood as shared roots rather than shared operations. Modern Vostok Europe is based in Vilnius, and its watches are presented as assembled and individually tested in Lithuania. That makes the Rocket N1 interesting for a few reasons. It carries the Made in Lithuania identity, but this blue sunburst dial example is also powered by a Japanese Seiko NH35, and it is fair to assume, as with most watches in this segment, that other components are sourced globally before final assembly. Vostok Europe's broader catalog tends to lean toward large, over-engineered statement pieces, often well outside the kind of enthusiast-led proportions I typically gravitate toward, which is why this more modest 39mm Rocket N1 immediately stood out to me. It is an unusual design, one that still feels distinctly Vostok Europe, but in a format that I suspect more watch enthusiasts will actually be willing to meet halfway. This particular blue NH35 powered Rocket N1 is priced at $373 and is made in 3,000 pieces. Let's check it out. The N1 makes a strong argument for itself with its case design, because while the overall dimensions are fairly approachable at 39mm in diameter, 46.15mm lug to lug, and 13.3mm thick, the design does not feel generic or softened down. The entire case carries a crisp angular motif, beginning with the brushed 12-sided fixed bezel, which gives the watch a more instrument-like character and also makes it surprisingly easy to read at a glance. That geometry continues into the angular polished case flanks, while the tops of the 20mm lugs retain the same brushed finish as the bezel, separated by a polished bevel that flows neatly into the polished midcase. At 3 o'clock, the 6mm push-pull crown has excellent grip and is easy to operate, with the brand's logo engraved on top. The domed crystal adds pleasing distortion at extreme angles, and with 100 meters water resistance, a screw-down display back, and solid anti-reflective coating, it feels like a properly versatile, everyday case. This is the blue dial version, and at its base is a gradient sunburst blue surface that stays fairly restrained most of the time, only really showing its brighter character when direct sunlight hits it. In softer light, it reads as a much darker and more subdued blue, which suits the watch well and gives the rest of the dial furniture a bit more authority. Around the periphery sits a printed minute track, interrupted by brushed applied hour markers that I think were very smartly handled. Had these been fully polished, they likely would have disappeared more often against the dark dial, but the brushing keeps them legible across a wider range of angles. I also particularly like the applied triangle at 12 with its circular lume plot, which feels a little creative and unusual without trying too hard. The applied logo beneath 12 is polished and fairly subtle, while above 6 there is a symmetrical date window with a white border and a color-matched date wheel, with the model name and specs printed just above it. The hands are well proportioned, finished to match the markers, and filled with generous lume, while the second's hand adds a nice bit of energy through its lumed lollipop counterbalance and painted red tip. The overall layout is clean, well judged, and highly legible. What I especially enjoy, though, is how the domed crystal plays with the dial at oblique angles. It gives the watch a hint of vintage charm, even if the design itself feels entirely contemporary. The lume is handled sensibly with generously sized lume plots on all of the hour markers and across the full width of the main hands, which gives the watch a solid baseline for low light legibility. It is reasonably potent at first charge, though I would not describe it as exceptional if you compare it with some of the stronger microbrand offerings in this price range. That said, it performs well enough in actual use, remaining readable for most of the night, even if it does not have the same immediate intensity or endurance you might expect from a more purpose-built dive watch. In my own comparison against pieces like the Vero Smoky Bear, Retro Vivo Diver, and Veo Solar Field, the Rocket N1 held up respectably and never felt inadequate, even if it was not the standout of the group. I've covered Seiko's NH35 family many times at this point, and my broader opinion has not changed much. These movements are generally robust, inexpensive, and easy to service or replace, which helps explain why they remain so common in the microbrand space. But Seiko's official accuracy tolerances are still far too lenient for a modern, mechanical movement, and the overall architecture is not interesting to look at or refined to operate. In general, once pricing begins moving toward the upper end of the affordable segment, I start expecting higher beat rates and tighter regulation standards. But at this price, I think it is a reasonable choice. This particular piece was running at +6 SPD, which is quite good for this movement. Wearability is where the Rocket N1 feels most relevant to my own taste, because while much of the brand's broader catalog tends to sit in a larger, more lifestyle-driven part of the market than I usually gravitate toward, this 39mm case with its 46.15mm lug-to-lug lands very comfortably on my 6.75-inch wrist. It has enough presence to feel like a sports watch, but never crosses into the oversized territory that defines so many of the brand's other models. The Seiko NH35 does mean the watch is a bit chunkier than it might have been with a slimmer movement, and at 13.3mm thick, it wears more or less exactly as you would expect, substantial but not awkward. My example came on the blue leather strap rather than the bracelet, paired with a signed buckle. The strap is decent and comfortable enough, even if I would have liked the buckle to echo the 12-sided case design instead of its more generic styling. The Rocket N1 is one of the more interesting watches in Vostok Europe's catalog, not just because the design is unusual, but because the proportions feel so much more restrained than what the brand is generally known for. The build quality is good, the finishing is thoughtfully executed for the price, and the overall presentation feels more considered than I expected going in. It is a little bulky in the way many NH35 powered watches tend to be, but never in a way that feels oversized or clumsy on wrist. More than anything, I think this is a compelling option for someone who wants a watch that feels a bit different, both in design and geographic perspective, while still being easy enough to wear every day. As always, thanks for watching, and please subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this review.